Welcome to the CLM for WPI, June 27th. This week I'll be presenting the third in my radicalization series, mainly focused on a couple of literature review questions and then exploring system states in Stella Architect.
Cool.
And if you, yeah, and you just can't even do you.
No, I forgot to sign in. I went to the site.
So let me go through. So what I need help on specifically is, so I'll be presenting this, let me take a step back. I'm presenting this in Iceland, and this will be the third article in my dissertation. The first two will be on emerging state actors like ISIS. The third will be on radicalization that leads to terrorism. What I need help on today is there's two brief sort of literature search type things I'm looking for. One is historical case studies on radicalization. The other is country measures on key indicators. I'll describe those a little more. But the bulk of today's session, I think, is on best practices in presenting a variety of system states using Stella Architect. So I'm looking for what people have done in the past, what they've seen, what makes sense, what's interpretable. I have a couple examples, but it's really open because a key part of the presentation is going to be on these system states. Historical cases of radicalization. I'm looking for things that are article length. I don't have time to read books right now. So something that's article or paper length, peer reviewed, covers several years to a decade on a specific country or region. And within it, hopefully, I'm kind of hoping within the paper we go over the rise of radicalization, any policy responses they had, how radicalization responded to these policies, whether it got worse or better. It doesn't need to be quantitative. That'd be great if they had data, but even if they said, we did this and it got worse, or we did this and it got better, they need not only be on Salifi Takfiri. I'm also interested in white supremacy, ultranationalism, online backlash and bullying, e.g. Gamergate. You know, any of these kinds of radicalization experiences, I'm interested in looking for case studies. Because what I'm doing with these system states, a system state map, as you'll see in a second here, is if a system can generate multiple behaviors, a system state tracks that behavior as it goes through the simulation. And what I'm doing for those, just as a refresher, is I'm looking at, is radicalization more grounds up, self-radicalized, local radicalization, or is there a terrorist organization that is driving radicalization? And this is the Fisherman versus Swarm. And so I'm looking at different kinds of radicalization, and the structure I have can generate lots of different system states. But I'd like to associate those with historical examples to say, this is the Indonesia example, or this is the Gamergate example, or this is the, you know, to kind of place these in context. So if anyone has any, feel free to shout out at any time now or afterwards, but this is any articles on case studies of radicalization. The second thing I'm looking for are country measures that track a country performance on an index or a metric. Ideally, they have data over many years and across different countries. It can be academic, government institution, or credible private, like The Economist has a corruption index. There's rules of law indexes. There's all these sort of national indicators. And what I'm looking for are indicators that relate to the research I'm doing, where I can say, here's a case study and this country scored low on the rule of law index, or this country was really good, and try to begin associating that. The things I'm looking for are sort of the credibility of rule of law, moral outrage in a country. I don't know how you measure that. Maybe it's a Pew survey, or whether there's an outrage. There's like, The Economist once had a shoe thrower index, which was how close a country was to going into a mass protest. So any ideas on that front, I'm open to.
Can I ask one question? So when you say academic, are you thinking K-12 academic performance? Are you thinking university?
No, I mean like academic publication, like research that is, yeah, because this is going to be on radicalization of some sort of violent thing. So it would probably be, in that case, what I mean is these measures don't have to come from a journal article. It'd be great if they did, but it may come from like a private magazine, like Washington Post's
Okay.
evaluation, or the UN or something.
What is the index? How do you spell that? I'm curious, and I'm curious about the U.S. score.
Index?
That
Shoe Throwers Index only tracks countries during the Arab Spring, and it was tracking countries based on their likelihood to have a revolt. So it's an example, and it's an index. So if you Google Shoe Throwers Index, INDEX, is indexed. And it took a bunch of different inflation rate, level of electoral.
What is the shoe?
Shoe throwers. Like you pick up a shoe and
like a
yeah, you pick up a shoe and throw the shoe at a figure because that was a common form of protest. And it was the economists during the Arab Spring was actually, and even before the Arab Spring broke out, they were studying the region by saying the indicators in this area look like it's going to be ripe for a revolt or uprising. And that's just an example. I mean, that's an example of sort of a private company's, not shoe throwers, like a shoe, yeah.
It's like, how was someone's name like Yelly Schumer?
Yeah, no, sorry.
No, it's okay.
And that's just an example of, there's these, if it's from a private organization, I'd like it to be fairly credible. Like The Economist has a pretty good track record. They're pretty credible.
You might check Freedom House.
Freedom House? Yeah, or even that's sources that might have these measures.
They measure.
Freedom House, is that the name of the org?
Yeah, the name,
Okay.
It's the name of the organization. They have ranking of each country.
Good, ranking.
Tim, Sean here. Tim, have you looked at the Center for Defense and Homeland Security at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey?
No, I have not. Center for Defense and Homeland Security?
Yeah, they have they run a nationwide master's program. They have a huge digital library, and I have a account I can look, but I'm just looking at it looks like you can get an account if you're a Homeland Security research and academic.
Huh.
And they've got a ton of stuff, and it's all very, very recent.
I will apply for that. Does it take a long time to get your application in, or is it just a?
No, I think it's just an email right away. I'm gonna I'll log on later on and just do a quick search. But I'm just looking at looks like you get as a Homeland Security researcher academic, you can get an account.
Yeah, excellent. What I'm trying to do here is not recreate the wheel of measures, but have something that I can bring into my model from something else.
Yeah, there's a ton of stuff. They got a lot of recent thesis from the students there. It's a combination of military and first responders. So Center for Homeland Defense and Security. It's a Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey.
And just as a reminder what we're talking about here, I'm going to share briefly the model itself. Make this a little bit larger. So this is the top level view of the model. And these are the sectors of the model. So this is a radicalization model, and it starts with a population of potential and actual radicals. They have a rate of mobilization. And I'm a little unhappy with Stella that it has all these arrows connecting. I got to figure out a way to make this cleaner, but this is somewhat of a high-level causal structure. Each of these has a subsector that you can go in and look at the stock and flow. And we looked at that last time. There's an online YouTube recording going through this model. But what I'm doing is using this model to run simulations of different conditions that result in different system states. So what some of those system states look for, shifting back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so what are system state best practices? Like, some of the questions I have are, what are good examples in literature displaying a system state? And a system state is typically an XY graph where time is not represented. So and I believe the whiteboard can get into the screen here. But a system state, Saeed, can you see this if I'm on the whiteboard?
You can see it through my screen, actually.
Okay. So normally a behavior over time has time on the bottom and some behavior here, and it looks like this, right? A system state graph takes two variables, plots one on the X and one on the Y, and what it does is it will start in some point and it will show the change of the thing over time. So it may look something like that. And what it's showing is the movement of the relationship between the two variables as the system state is. And you have to know it started here and ended here to kind of get the spec of what's happening over time. And it's a way of conveying information that is sometimes more useful than just having one line on a chart, because especially in this, when we're talking about system states of Fisherman and Swarm and the change between them, you can start to do like a quadrant graph. So if there's literature, system dynamics literature, people know articles where they've done catalogs of system states where they said, here's 5 system states. And it was presented really well. I'm looking for that. Any ideas? what is the right number of system states? I actually did 50 tests. I have 50 system states. A lot of them are fairly similar, but I mean, like, what's the right number? 5, 8, 20. With Stella Architect, should the graphs be bounded into labeled quadrants, or should I just export the data and visual? And I'll go through some examples here, as you can see, but this is some of the stuff I'm thinking of. And then how to balance sort of sophistication of measurement with ease of understanding. Like how easy is it for someone to take away? And I've got 2 designs. The first one here is the system state across 2 axes. So if the graph goes from 0 to 1 on the x-axis.
Tim,
yes.
We don't see your screen.
You're not seeing. Are you clicked on the TV Clancy?
Yes.
You're not seeing the.
Because you stopped sharing, right? I guess.
Here, let me share. I'll just share it again. Does that show up now?
Yes. Now it's working.
Okay. Thanks. Good call. So this is the first system state, which is literally a system state across axis. The x-axis is the percent of radicals in the system that are affiliated with a terrorist organization. TO is terrorist organization. So 0 means Fisherman, 100% are affiliated with the TO. Swarm is 0%. So across this bottom axis here is 0 to 1. And the y-axis is the terrorist organization's contribution to radicalization. So one is how many people are actually affiliated with the terrorist organization. The other is how much do terrorist organizations contribute to radicalization, even if they don't end up being affiliated. And the reason this creates a good system state is you have 0 to 1 on both, and you get 2 clear quadrants, one of which is the lower left. If it's in here, it's a fisherman state. That means the foreign terrorist organizations and domestic organizations are contributing to radicalization, and they got the most people. Up here in the upper right, it's a clear swarm state. It's all local self-radicalization. It doesn't rely on terrorist organizations. It doesn't need that. And so the question mark is, what do you call these 2 quadrants, which are sort of hybrids? In this one, most of the radicalization is done by a terrorist organization, but not many people are members of that terrorist organization. And in this one down here, many people are members of the terrorist organization, but it's some other factor that's causing the radicalization. And so I could run a simulation, and if it moves from the swarm over this way and ends up in Fisherman, that tells us the system state moved from swarm to Fisherman, is the purpose of this. And I'll show you some examples where it does this. Or it could say it stays in Fisherman the entire time. The second design, and this is, there we go. Does this design number 2 show up, Saeed? Okay, so this is now takes, the x-axis stays the same, which is just the number of radicals that are affiliated with the terrorist organization, but it now adds in behavior. See, in the previous one, you didn't know whether there were more or less radicals than when you started. So this now adds behavior by saying, we start with a midpoint of 1, which is the number of radicals we started with. And if you go above 1, that means there's growth relative to that initial starting point. If you go down, you're actually reducing the number of radicals. So now you have Fisherman is on the left, Swarm is on the right, and it tells you, is it a contained threat or is it an escalating threat? So now you can evaluate policies as they shifted from Swarm to Fisherman, but it escalated it and it got more radicals than we started with, which is a bad thing. So this now looks at, it combines a behavior mode and a system state. And so this may be easier to understand with some actual examples sort of side by side, which I created and kind of posted here. So this top one is an existing, is a case. So this is the leftmost one is the first one I described, where if you can imagine there's sort of a quadrant here. And if it's upper right, it's Swarm. If it's lower left, it's Fisherman. And if it's in between there, it's sort of a hybrid. And so this shows at the start of the simulation, it started in Fisherman and then dropped dramatically, came back up, and sort of ended up in sort of this more mixed state. The other one shows that it's really hard to see. Like when I did this, it was surprising how useless this was in some ways, because it stayed the same number of terrorists for the most part, but it went from, it went from a Fisherman or Swarm state to a Fisherman and back again, and it's so it's kind of moving back and forth along this line. But you can't tell that because it's all laid on top of itself. What was your question, Christine?
So this graph is completely new to me. So the thinner line is the beginning, then more.
Yeah, these are actually connected scatter. It's a connected scatter plot in Stella Architect, which I think that's the way to do a system state, is a connected XY scatter plot.
Yeah, so two questions. First, does this pink curve goes to negative? Does it go to negative kind of area? Because
there's a problem in the model that hasn't been debugged. So just ignore that part for now. It does. Okay. It should not be going negative. You are correct. That's a bug.
Another question is that have you tried to adjust the scale on the right graph? Because I see some dynamics there, but the scale I think is too wide to show that.
That's a good point, because it goes from basically staying at the same up to 5 times as many radicals as you started. So even if there's little changes, they'll get buried in that. I can replicate this in the model if we want to run it. I'll go through the examples first, but I can go in the model and change the scale and test that. That may be a good one, because you can see on the bottom one, in case 35.
Yes, so maybe, I mean, a 0 to 5 is a very large scale for your case. Maybe you should limit that to 0 to 2.
What would it be? There are some scenarios that are so bad you can actually get up to, I don't know if you get to 5, but you can get over 2. In those cases,
can you go back to your previous slide?
Yeah.
Is there a way to kind of normalize the y-axis to contain things, you know, between some standard kind of variation, instead of, because currently I think your scale, I mean, the changes on the y-axis is on infinity actually in your model, because that can go from 0 to infinity.
That's exactly the question that I was asking about. Bounded, when you go up here to this one, is can Stella Architect graphs be bounded into labels? So the question is, what would be a way to bound this? Because it's a relative change. So 1 is no change. 0 means it's gone to 0, right? But there's an infinite y. So how would you bind that or normalize it so you could have like a 2 to -2 or 1 to 1? Because in some cases it's going to go high. It can go much higher, but it can't go below 0. Because it's a relative measurement of the starting radicalized versus the current.
Okay, so I think the only way to do this is to change your measure. Because
right, I'm open to ideas.
A relative change can become infinite.
Right.
It can be a very, very large number or 0.
I mean, I guess I could. Would it make sense to change it to, rather than the measure of absolute radicals, you measure the growth rate in radicals? Because that would be between 1 and -1. And anything above 0 means a positive growth rate in radicals. And anything below 0, you wouldn't know, though, how you were doing relative to where you started. Which is the key part of this, is do you have less radicals based on your policies than you did when you started? Or are your policies creating? Because here's another set, for example, that show 2 different cases. And in this case, you can see how you have a policy that starts out, and it starts out reducing radicals, so it looks good, and then a threshold point is triggered, and it dramatically increases radicals. And so these are a little bit more provocative cases. They're a little bit, more dramatic behavior. But this one down here, it decreases radicals, and they stay decreased. So I'm wondering how I could bound this. Like in this case, if I decrease the scale and just cut it off at 2, I'd lose all this information, but it would be more meaningful, I think, to just say, yeah, it went up a lot and it continued going. I'm trying to think of ways, because what I'm doing with this is the core of the article. So I'm trying to figure out, what am I aiming to from a visual presentation of information, and then backing into everything from there. See, the problem with these ones is these are both bounded, except for the error. Let's forget the error, pretend that doesn't exist. But they're always going to exist somewhere within the quadrants. They're not going to, the values should be between 0 and 1 and 0 and 1. what I'm trying to figure out is whether this is useful at all, because so much of it doesn't show variation, but then it does have some representation of the level of threat. And this is really my key question for system state diagrams, as to how to present this.
Too many words, sorry.
So what was the y-axis on that pink diagram? What was it again?
So this, the y-axis on this is the percent of radicalization that can be attributed to the terrorist organization. So if you think about it, there's people who are radicals are going online and they're posting radical content, but then there's also a terrorist organization that has created propaganda and spreading it out and doing YouTube videos and Twitters and all that stuff. And it looks at the rate of mobilization and sort of allocates how much is coming from people just being radicals online versus how much is an intentional propaganda process. And the 1 here means that 100% of the propaganda radicals is created by sort of local actors. A 0 means it's all coming from foreign actors. So what this system state tells you is you start in a swarm space where it's just all localized, and it drops to where you start getting some foreign actors in there, and as the foreign actors, it begins to shift and ends up in a fisherman state here, where you're now the foreign terrorist organization is being more prevalent, and then it shifts, which actually, as dramatic as this one looks, it's actually a lot closer to what's happened in Europe and the US in some cases, in that you had largely local actors, but then there was a catastrophic attack by Al-Qaeda that shifted attention foreign, and then all of a sudden the foreign elements were making the most difference. And then as we get into the ISIS years, it goes back to being self-radicalized coming from the ISIS part. So it's kind of showing a dramatic change. And then the question is, can you make these graphs so that you have the quadrant bars in the charts here so that it can easily see where the 4 quadrants are? Or do you need to just export it, put it in Excel, and make your charts by hand?
Can you last slide? Really?
I don't think there's a feature for that in Stella.
Yeah, the quadrant's like a 4-block Gartner quadrant.
I mean, I haven't explored it that much, but it's not something
So yeah, I think you need to export it. I'm not sure, by the way. Perhaps you should ask Carrie, but I haven't seen that feature before.
I'm still really hung up on this because I'm a 3-dimensional would be more comfortable with me with time. Whenever I see graphs and I don't have time, I get messed up.
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges of a system. A system state graph has implied time that, but when it's, like this, it's hard to tell where time is. There's not much.
Yeah, unless it's 3-dimensional.
Right. And a 3-dimensional space, I would figure, would cause more confusion for more readers, but maybe that would be, I could do that in Excel pretty easily.
I think that's the one on the bottom here is the one that kind of freaks me out. That is on the bottom right.
This one?
Trying to interpret. How do you interpret that?
Right. So what it's showing is that the policy is shifting it, but it actually results in an increase in terrorists at the end.
But
that's what vertical on these ones is basically your one means you have the same number of radicals as you started with.
Right.
And if you go above 1, that means your policies are resulting in more radicals,
right.
More people that.
So the top right. So the top right is saying that there is no change.
Or I think the change is so small that it's buried in the scale.
So that does tell you something, though. If the
Right.
change, because when you compared case 20 with the case beyond it, then there is a difference.
Yeah, these two are substantively different because the change is so small it disappears, compared to something like this where the change is so dramatic.
Right, but when you say it disappears, my question, I guess, is if it's that small of a change, is that change even statistically significant? It might not be.
Well, my guess is I can put in the data and we can run it, but my guess is it's like 100 or 200 radicals over 1,000 person.
Right. So
because the model starts with 1,000 radicals, and it can go up to 16,000 radicals.
So in effect, there could be no change statistically.
Yeah, you might have 1,050 or something.
So I actually don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
With how that looks, because to me that it makes sense that there is a change here.
Right, and imagine these now being presented in groups, so you can see
The difference.
the differences between them.
So that doesn't bother me.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Because to me it tells a story.
Would you be upset then if I just cut it off at 2 and had 0 to 2 and said, and so maybe had a number that said total radicals at end or something? Because then you could see those, it would be a little bit more, there'd be less straight lines.
Right.
It'd be a little more descriptive, and it could say, look, this one ends up with a lot of radicals, but it's not depicted on the graph.
I think, well, my only issue with that is there's such dramatic difference between this case here and the one on your last slide. I don't know that you're going to show that dramaticness of it if you cut it off at 2.
Right, then it will, you could mistake this one here will look the same as this one if it cuts off at 2.
Mm-hmm.
Even though this one goes way higher.
It goes way higher. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Case 45 and case 49, you may not. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you make the graphs as a video? Then it's plotting here, and then he'll put this on your quadrant over here too, so you see 2 simultaneous things.
But it's running in like an animation,
Yes.
not in an article. For
Oh, an article, yeah. Because we're thinking presentation.
Yeah. What?
Snapshot.
You can have animation in paper too. I mean, you can have, as Christine said, the snapshots at different time intervals.
So I could do snapshots of
That's a great
time.
idea, especially for that one, the one with that case, whatever that
I'm
was.
just thinking is then that would probably reduce the number of different cases you're looking at, because each case would have several pictures of itself.
The time.
And I don't know
For
how many cases.
example, you can have 6 graphs for each run, and then divide your time by 6, and in each graph you will have a diagram at each certain time.
Yeah, I can do that and break it into snapshot. Oh, hey, Rafat.
Hi.
In the background. Okay.
Yep. So Rafat, to catch you up, we're looking at different system state examples. The one on the left is a 4-quadrant. Here. The one on the left is a quadrant that has a 0 to 1 normalized axis, where the lower left is Fisherman, the upper right is Swarm, and the system state moves between them. The second example actually only has left versus right is Fisherman versus Swarm, and the y-axis is now behavior. Are there more or less radicals than when you started, where 1 means about the same number, 2 means twice as many radicals, 0 means there's no radicals. And these are just some examples of those two side by side. The same case depicted into 2 different system states. And ignore where it goes beneath 0 here, that's a bug. But in this case, it goes from Swarm over to this hybrid state. Here, it goes Swarm to hybrid and back a little. On the other design, this one is too small of a change to appear, so the scale is too large, whereas this one shows that you've actually increased. And then you have more dramatic examples of system behavior with different cases. And I'm trying to get a feel for how many cases should I have. This is going to be a normal 20 to 30 page article probably. How many, the idea came up of creating snapshots over time so you could see it evolve and develop, doing 6 of those. And then what's the best way to present these system states, as make them meaningful and useful.
So what are these cases? What do you mean by
The cases are combinations of different starting conditions in terms of the presence of a foreign terrorist organization or not, and whether there is no significant terrorist attack, and so there's a normal level of terrorism. That's just sort of the standard equilibrium. The model starts in equilibrium, but then it's disturbed by a terrorist attack that kills more people than normal. So the society reacts, and then you have a policy choice of do you react by focusing domestically or foreign, and to what level of credibility is your law enforcement? What means do you use in law enforcement? So that's in the, your policy levers are basically how you respond once a terrorist attack occurs. And the terrorist attack there can be nothing out of the normal, it's just a normal steady eddy. It can be, there's a significant one, which is a 10 times multiplier. or it can be a catastrophic one, like a 9/11 case where it's 100 times multiplier. And so these two represent, there was an existing terrorist organization that launched a catastrophic attack at time 10. And then the response to that was to evenly split the terrorist response, foreign and domestic, with sort of a mixed credibility. This one is there's a persistent terrorist organization and they launch a catastrophic attack at time 30, so it's later, and they have very high credibility, domestic and foreign response. And you can see the difference in that credibility of response, I think, in terms of you end up with lower radicals versus a higher radical.
So I have I mean, because you have 50 of these cases and you can't.
Well, and the 50, there's a lot of them that are like, that's not much different, I don't want to do them. So.
No, so I think what you have, and I'm sure you've thought a lot about this because you've given us 4 examples, but I think the 4 examples is not enough because you need case 45 with a high response. You need case 49.
And that's where it gets a little tricky is your starting conditions and your policy responses create kind of, say, 4 parameters that you can do. So to fully explore one case would take 4.
Right.
But it may not be necessary. And this is where I'm thinking of articles that have done these system state catalogs, whether there's examples of how to present that and say, here's some notional ones, here's some interesting ones, here's some policy relevant ones.
Because I know I'm sitting here seeing this for the first time and I'm thinking, okay, so case 45, I wonder what would happen if with time 10, but with high credibility domestic.
And that's what those 50 cases, I have them sort of, they're a full exploration and I can do sensitivity tests. So there's a full policy exploration. The question is, how do you put into the article the limited set? And what's interesting also, what's useful for the viewers, what's interesting, so Sean, my question maybe to you is if you're law enforcement, or what's interesting, what's useful for you to take away? The difference between Fisherman and Swarm, or something that's more practical, like you ended up with more or less radicals than you started with, or something else?
You're still muted if you're trying to speak. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, Sean, your mute's on. I don't know if you're trying to speak. But
And I missed the first part of the question.
Sure.
Well, for practical from a law enforcement.
Yeah, which, I mean, imagine you've got an article which, you know, ideally this goes to policymakers and you have text that context is right. So you have explanations of sort of what you're looking at, but what's more useful from a visual? Something that shows the difference between where the threat of radicalization is coming, independent of how big a threat it is, or something that combines both where the threat's coming and whether we're winning or losing against the threat, or some other combination.
Yeah, I think it would be where the threat's coming from and what the mechanism is of the radicalization, because that's where you're going to have your intervention is right at that level. So if you can understand the process that it's coming, that's happening, and where it's coming from, that would probably be from a very practical, tactical area. That'd be the most valuable.
So that would be the slide on the left here, which shows where it's coming from, and then you could almost isolate parts and say, if you're up here, your intervention should be X, Y, Z. If you're down here, your intervention should be this. It's almost like if you're in this space, this is the kind of intervention you should have to reduce the terrorists in that space. Is that what you?
Yeah, and they're going to be looking anywhere along that axis, like the most vulnerable point, to kind of break that chain, right? So from somebody who just starts looking at becoming radicalization to actually doing something, I mean, there's a lot of links in that chain that if you can break one of them, you've stopped the event. So they would look at from top to bottom where the weakest link is and where the intervention is going to have the most effect.
Okay, thank you.
Although I just have one question, a follow-up question. On the right-hand side, this is that relative change in radicals, right? And that seems, can you go to the slide before? Because I'm trying to think of what is it that will cause. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, it wasn't what I thought. It wasn't what I thought was going to happen. So I guess what I'm asking is there value to knowing the effect of the response to that, the relative change?
Well, I could have one slide that's a system state, that is this one. And then the slide next to it can just be a behavior over time of the number of radicals. Right, not try and make it a system state.
Okay.
So it would show the increase of radicals over time or the decrease, but it would be a side-by-side, a system state on one, which is the origin and nature of the threat in a system state diagram, and the one on the right of the two is the actual change in number of radicals.
Right.
And side by side.
I guess I was thinking about if you have limited resources, if you have an understanding of the impact of the origin and nature of radicalization on the actual number of radicals being formed, then it will help you think about where you're going to direct those resources.
Right, and just as a caveat, this is a system level model, so it doesn't get super down in the weeds. That's for follow-on.
For sure, for sure.
For follow-on. But I think the goal of this is to guide sort of where are we at and what policy we be pursuing based on where we're at.
Right.
That kind of discussion. So maybe.
So then I definitely agree with Sean that those left graphs, if you are limited in time and scope for this one paper and you're thinking about what am I going to do next, do that other thing next.
Right, and so,
That makes a lot of sense.
and Mike, I'm also hearing that taking these out of Stella, putting them into Excel where I can create a quadrant with like little shaded blocks that could say, that are very clear you're in a fisherman state or a swarm state, and I need to come up with names of the hybrid states, you know. I called one boiling the frog. I don't know what the, you know, I don't know what the names would be of these hybrid states, sort of a, but.
Also, I think you should have separate titles for the X and Y axis, because currently your diagrams is very confusing, this versus that. Okay, which one is X and which one is Y?
I tried to get it to put the legends of X, Y on the graph, and I just didn't hit the right button in Stella. But certainly there should be an overall title, a Y-axis label, an X-axis label, the division into quadrants, and then maybe shading of the quadrants of which the line that moves through. And I think if I can get this right in Excel, I could actually have arrows that show the direction over time. So you know where you started it from, and you can, you know, so you know, because in this one, if you watch them in simulation, you know that they're starting up here, and it goes this way and ends up here, but you don't know that just by looking at the picture. Another question is, should I somehow normalize this so that it starts in the exact middle? In the equilibrium state right now, the equilibrium is a swarm state. It's a local radicalization, and that's just the way I designed it. I can redesign it so that equilibrium puts the point in the very middle where it is perfectly balanced between swarm and fisherman, and then it says, okay, now we're starting in equilibrium from a standpoint of behavior, but also equilibrium from a standpoint of system state.
Yes, I think doing it in the middle, in the center, would be more clear.
Now I just got to figure out how to do that. That's a math problem.
I did this in my paper of the descent paper. All the graphs are state space, and they're all starting from exactly the center. So we can talk about that.
I believe that it is not a systems question. It is, or a method question. It is, I think, kind of content question. So you need to ask, or domain question. So you need to ask which one makes more sense for your audience.
Well,
I mean, it doesn't matter if it starts from 1 and 1 or open 5 and open 5. In terms of method, it should matter from the domain perspective.
It's a generic structure, so it doesn't represent any country. The reason I was asking about historic cases is I could find historic cases and identify them within the state spaces and say, this is like the US white supremacy example, or this is like the Indonesia insurgency example, or something like that. But that's going to be a secondary based on time and ability to wrangle that information. I'm purely using a generic structure now. And so it sounds like Rafat's vote is for in the center. Saeed's vote is it doesn't matter as long as they know where it starts and where it's going.
My vote is actually to repeat this from different starting states, because that could matter. I mean, that could change your kind of the implications of your results, because I don't know. I mean, you need to test it. You need to test the model's response by changing the initial states. So
doing a sensitivity test on initial conditions and learning Stella's sensitivity through that, which I'm not as familiar with yet, but doing that to explore the policy spaces, to do that a little bit. What I'm trying to really nail down here is sort of what my end goal from a visualization is, so I can really be focused on how I'm error correcting the model, fixing the model, debugging it, and sort of what I'm programming to over the next month. This has been
again, with sensitivity test is also part of debugging, because if you start your model from different states, and if your model then the results don't make sense, then you need to debug it again. So that's part of debugging. Sensitivity is always part of validation tests. So.
Yeah, I will not be doing a full validation suite on this like I did for the ISIS model. That was 160 pages of validation test. I may pick out a few like sensitivity and family reproduction and stuff like that.
So that title, you have percentage affiliated to terrorist organization versus terrorist organization contribution to radicalization. One is y-axis, one is this?
Yeah, it's interesting. These are the labels you put in Stella, and from those it produced this title. Like if you go in the Stella model, which I can't hear.
What's the difference between those two verses?
Let's see, that's the get the interface screen. So this is the interface screen in Stella, right? And so, okay, let me get this. So if you look at this, there we go. So you can see here it's a scatter with connected points, and then these are the actual data, the X and Y, and you can change the legend title, but there's nowhere I could find in here to make the legend visible on the axis. It creates the title that goes across the top by combining what you put in here in these legend titles. It combines whatever you've worded. So if I go in here and I'm kind of, if I go in and change this to, watch what happens to the graph when I delete this, right? See how it changed it automatically? It automatically is assembling that title.
But I feel like when I mean, again, my Stella is limited to
Right.
SD550, but I remember having axis titles.
But were those, I'm wondering if you have them when you go away from scatter to something like a line chart.
Maybe
And that a scatter is by default, because I was looking all over for axis titles to be able to do them, but I couldn't
maybe
find
that's
them.
what it was. Can you click on lines to see if that was it? Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's something buggy about the scatter. What about? Yeah, it's bizarre. Yeah, so it's only the scatter plot that.
The scatter, yeah, it sort of takes away the option to have an axis legend.
Yeah,
But that will matter a lot. If I'm going in Excel, I have more control.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's easy to have those. But it's odd to me.
Tell Kareem.
And it may be that it's fixed in a later update. I think I'm at 1.5 or something like that.
So in statistics and other things, we know why the X. I know
Yeah.
already. You don't have to tell me. If I read it. What is your Y and X? What are the variables?
The variables in this case is X is the percentage of radicals in the population who are affiliated to a terrorist organization, and the Y is the rate of radicalization that can be contributed to the terrorist organization generated. So you can have people radicalized that don't end up affiliating with the terrorist organization. ISIS is an example of this. They pump out a lot of propaganda. People self-radicalize. They're never formally associated, but they're being sort of inspired by what's going on in the environment. Versus Al-Qaeda, which would have them come over and join the recruitment camps and maybe train them and stuff like that and have a more formal affiliation.
That is incorrect. It should be Y, X, not X. Anyway, that's not important. So one is causing the other?
Well, in this graph, there are two different looks at the nature of the threat, which is, one is where are your sources of radicalization coming from? And the other is the people who themselves are radicals, how are they being distributed? Are you looking for networks of people? And because the way you go out and investigate someone who is a self-radicalized loner is very difficult than looking for someone who may be part of a network, like a terrorist network.
So one of them is showing that self-radicalized, one of them is affiliation? Is it?
Yeah, the bottom shows the affiliation, the percent of the radicals that are affiliated. This shows who is contributing more towards radicalization. Is it the individuals that are just out there creating content, or is it the terrorist organization that is creating more?
I just wanted to make one comment about the initial state question, whether it be in the middle or 1 or 0 or whatever. My comment, again, not knowing this situation specifically, but from a reader's perspective, it actually would not matter to me where you started as long as you could justify why you're starting there.
So give a narrative.
There has to be a reason. If you're calling that the equilibrium state, how do you know that that's the equilibrium state? Or what I don't know if you're calling it equilibrium or additional.
So we have, I could go back and say data for either state. Europe was a fisherman state.
Right.
US was a swarm state. And I could say this represents a starting condition of either.
Right.
But, and I would just be arbitrarily picking it.
Right.
I think it would be hard to justify a pure middle state with some sort of historical analogy because they tend to swing one way or another. But it's a generic structure. I could say for purposes of illustrating policy choices, we're deciding it in the middle, even though that's sort of artificial. We're going to start, like, equilibrium is an artificial state, but we start in equilibrium so we can disturb it and see what the impact is. So, so basically, the key thing, though, is whatever I do start with, have a good justification and reason.
As to why, yeah. And I guess I would still question if it's artificial. I guess from the reader's perspective, I would still question, does starting in this artificial place actually impact the result?
Yeah,
it might not. I'm just saying that as from a reader's perspective.
Yeah, and that may be that there may be a significant, because everything in this is artificial. I say the pool of people who could be radicalized are 10,000.
Oh.
The number of starting radicals is 1,000. They are very arbitrarily selected values,
right.
So that we're focusing less on any country specific and more on just like what are the generic policy responses that arise from.
Then that's your justification. What you just said totally satisfied me.
Note to self, where the recording is, go back.
Can you show different starting points?
Yeah, I could. And it's all about space. How much, because within the course of the article, I've got to do the literature review. I've got to do a little bit of data comparison. I have to have 2 causal loop diagrams. And then some amount of space will be to display these system states in graph forms. And those tend to take up a lot of space in the graph and then discuss them.
Does the behavior change if you start from a different middle point?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think the sensitivity test would across initial states, I know it matters whether if the terrorist organization is already existing and putting out propaganda, that definitely influences the behavior. But I don't know if it's all ones you have with the terrorist organization are all going to be in the same style of behavior when they start, or whether different ways you start the terrorist organization itself matters. Like how many permutations of different starting states are there? But that's where I'm hoping the sensitivity test will shed some light.
And then my last question is in terms of application. So let's say you say, like you say, this is not arbitrary. This was carefully chosen to represent the relationships between these things in the system, right? So if you choose this starting point that's in the middle, then can you say somewhere that this can be altered to apply it to a very specific country? Do you know what I'm saying? So here's the general state of how things are, beginning with this equilibrium that we have set at this. But later on, if a country were to come to you and say, we need you to analyze our country, you could actually alter the initial starting
point. I think that's a great thing to put in my conclusion because it sets up the next article. No, I mean, that's a great, it's sort of saying this is generic and it can be initialized for specific countries.
Then that, again, that would totally satisfy me.
Yeah. So, okay.
may I make a correction? I was wrong. Wait, I have such a handwritten. So when I said it's YBX, they are right. It's actually Y. Like when we talk about XY coordinates, you put
Yeah.
X first.
And this is going to be in a journal article where I don't know if I can rely on people immediately grasping that. So I think just putting it in Excel and making everything as visual and apparent as possible. Now, the only murkiness to throw into is the original purpose of this was to resolve this debate between Sageman and Hoffman, who were arguing it was one or the other. They were kind of saying, look, it's either swarm or it's Fisherman, and they're not in between, and to show that a system can move back and forth. Does that have any difference as to where we put the starting points? Because I have a feeling that regardless of where we start it, there will be cases we can find where it moves around and sort of says they're really arguing two sides of the same system. Does that seem to have an influence or not? Okay. Doesn't seem like it matters. So that's the end of my presentation.
I just don't know how to respond.
I think I can do both because I think it will show, like I'll pick some cases that show movement, sort of do that. Okay, so that's all I had to present. It was very focused on state spaces and doing that because that's something I want to do in this model that I haven't done before. I'm going to look up Rafat's article and see how he presented it. And
naming those two quadrants, which we didn't talk about.
Yeah. If anyone has an idea of what it is, like what these names would be, like cool, quirky names, but.
Do you have like something written about this?
Oh gosh, yeah. I have like a 70-page paper on this. On my
Can I look at it?
yeah, it's on ResearchGate. I'll send a link out to people, but it's for those who are now we're still being recorded. If you go on ResearchGate and look for Timothy Clancy, I have my quals was done on this, and as part of my quals, I had all sorts of stuff I was looking at. That's a 70-page paper. And I got to narrow it down and focus on, one thing.
What's the text? What's the font and the size, and is it double spaced?
No, it's 12 point. It may be single font or single space, I think. Yeah. The last question I had on my quals was Professor Said said, "You did all of this in 2 weeks." I said, "Yes." He goes, "You're fast."
You're good. You're good to go.
Which one? It's the one that has all the violent stuff on it, like mass shooting and ISIS and.
It says conference presentation, video presentation.
If you look on radicalization, and then there should be a working draft paper. It's a Word document. So, any other questions for the overall thing, or I'm going to stop the recording?
Oh, this is. Oh,
Yeah.
no, nothing on this. It's
Okay, so who is?
Okay, sweet.
Yeah.
Hold on. I'm a little unprepared. I was distracted.
Oh, next week is the 4th.
Oh, it's July 4th.
Okay, no next week. Everyone enjoy 4th of July. All right.
But then the next person. I'm confused.
Talk to you later.
Thanks, Sean.
Yep, bye.
Yeah, that's that.
I hope.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see everyone.
Thank you, Saeed. Thank you, Rafat. Good luck in your
Good to
future.
see you, everyone.
But yeah,
Yeah.
no, I'm at the very beginning.
Bye.
I don't have the model yet. I just have the.
Take care, Rafat.
I give less than half-baked ideas all the time. And people help me.
I just realized that the recording is off. Hopefully I turned it off at some point, or is it recording? Because it's showing
I'm still
this.
on the call.
Oh, because I'm recording on this screen.
Yeah.